Hello and welcome to the Despawn Podcast. I am your host, Paul Despawn. Today we are doing another episode of the Despawn Podcast where we talk to fans about their fandoms. This one is going to be a fun one, I feel. It is all about the wonderful world of role-playing games. So we got an expert on. It is a gentleman that I have been following for a while. I think he also refers to himself as this, but he's a bit of an RPGenius. It is the wonderful NorZZa. NorZZa, how you doing, my dude?
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. I'm good. How are you?
I am fantastic. I'm excited to talk RPGs with you. I'm sure we're going to get to some fun conversations. For those that don't know you, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'm NorZZa. I make RPG related content on YouTube, primarily around guides and character builds and reviews of RPGs, and really just anything that you could want from an RPG is kind of what I try to cover on YouTube. And yeah, so that's mostly what I do. I've been playing games since I was I don't know 6 or 7, and got a PlayStation 1 and a Game Boy with Pokemon on it. Pokemon was baby's first RPG, and it still is these days.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's where I came from.
Awesome. So one of the first questions I was going to ask is, where did your love of RPGs come from? But I'm guessing it was around Pokemon and things like that.
For sure, yeah. Pokemon was definitely my first real. I struggle to say the word real because I mean these days it isn't really. It's more just you mash A and then you finish the game.
Hmm.
But it was my first RPG, and like starting with I think Gold was my first, and then I got Red, and yeah, like I put hundreds of hours into it, and I've always loved the loop of leveling up and feeling that progression cycle, and it just hooked me back then. And then I think the thing that really solidified it for me would be the Bethesda titles, playing Oblivion on my Xbox 360, and I didn't have a lot of money as a kid, so I only got a very limited amount of games, and RPGs are hundreds of hours experiences that you can play completely different ways and try different builds, and getting Oblivion and the DLCs and just playing that game on loop for years, really
Yeah.
trying different character builds and trying different decisions and joining different guilds and doing stuff, and that's really where a lot of my love comes from, is just the freedom and the immersion that you can get from those kind of games.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously, for anyone who knows you, obviously they probably know you're from the YouTube side. So obviously you do a lot of character builds, as you mentioned, things like that. Is it that kind of did that love of RPGs kind of force you into, well, not force you, but lead you into the route of that kind of creative aspect of doing all the analytical stuff of the builds and things like that, or was it kind of you are kind of analytical and that love kind of pushed it into RPGs? How does that kind of work with you in regards to the content you do?
Yeah, I would say it's a little bit of both. So even in my professional career, I've always been very analytical and looking at data sets and stuff in a previous life when I was a system administrator, and I've always liked that kind of data, and always liked it in my games too, and being able to figure out, doing X and Y will give you, a certain solution or make your character so much more powerful, and trying to find those min-maxing different, way to make you more powerful, and then trying different things that maybe isn't the most powerful build but is still fun, and trying to find that enjoyment. And they both kind of linked into each other. And then for the YouTube side, it's something that there isn't a whole lot of people out there that are actually making character builds and those style of content on YouTube. There's only 2 or 3 channels I can think of off the top of my head, and I saw that there was a niche for it there, and that's kind of where I decided to put my 2 cents in.
Awesome. And yeah, I think it works really well. And I mean, obviously, just getting into like at the beginnings, obviously, you mentioned you like Pokemon and things like that, and you moved on to the Bethesda titles. What is it about those kind of RPGs that you fell in love with most? Is it obviously, like you mentioned, is it the kind of how you could do those character builds and do the fun things? What is it about those specifically, or RPGs specifically, as opposed to like other genres in video games that you kind of fell in love with?
Yeah, I think to boil it down to one word, it'd be freedom.
Hmm.
So the freedom in exploration, being able to go anywhere you want, freedom in dialogue choices, quests, etc., freedom in character builds. There's so much that you can do in those games, and getting the bang for your buck was really important to me as a kid, and I was very I would always look up the games that I was going to buy and see how many hours, what you could do, and that was always things that I looked for, is those kind of RPG elements. And at the time, I didn't realize really what I was like looking for holistically, in that it was an RPG in an open world, or maybe not open world, but those kind of games where you can make different decisions and have different builds and stuff and classes, etc. Like, didn't really know what exactly what I was looking for at the time, but it was those games often had a lot of hours that I could put into, and so that's why I went those routes really. But
Awesome.
it's freedom and yeah, open worlds is the main thing. Immersion, like not every RPG has to have classes and stuff. Like I would classify Red Dead Redemption 2 as an RPG because you are
Mhm.
playing the role of Arthur, and that game is just like filled to the brim with immersion. But
Yeah.
yeah, I know you like RPGs as well, so let's hear why you like them.
Pretty similar to what you said. I think the immersion into like an open world is fantastic, and it's something that you don't get a lot of in like other genres. Like you got your shooters and things like that, and the bigger titles and action adventure. You don't really kind of get to create your character in an open world and have that freedom to run around and do what you want in those worlds. I find obviously that open-ended aspect to some of the stories, even when it is like playing named characters, it gives you a bigger scope to do things with the story that you wouldn't necessarily be able to do in other genres. I think that's what I always fell in love with personally. But I mean, I just want to jump into one thing you said at the beginning there. Obviously, you started off in games like Pokemon, and then you've got to games like the Bethesda titles, so like Oblivion, Skyrim, those kind of things. What was like the history for you through like your childhood, through from starting out at Pokemon? Like, what are the big RPGs that stood out for you as a kid and going forwards?
Yeah, pulling on the memory here.
Yeah.
So first, definitely Pokemon. On
Mhm.
the I got a PlayStation 1 not too long after I got a Game Boy. I don't really remember any back then that I had. The ones that like immediately jumped to the front of my mind is Dragon Age Origins and Oblivion, and then Morrowind. I played on my PC not too long after I got into Oblivion. They're the first kind of couple that really jumped to the front of my mind, but I'm sure there's plenty of others that just can't remember um, from back in those days. But JRPGs was something that escaped me.
Okay.
I never really got too much into them. I know they were big in the PlayStation 2 days with Kingdom Hearts and the Final Fantasies, and they just I don't know. Interest levels for me as a child, they just never really came. I wasn't too into it. I had played some Kingdom Hearts at a friend's house back in the old days. I think it was the first Kingdom Hearts game on the PlayStation 2. I think that was it 2 or 3? I don't know.
I think
But
that would have been two. Yeah.
yeah. But yeah, no, it just never grabbed me, I guess. The JRPGs and their systems, which is funny because I was so into Pokemon as a kid, and they're a lot of the DNA of a Pokemon game and that linear RPG progression is seen in a lot of JRPGs as well.
Mhm.
But yeah, no, I went the different route with more of a Western style to a lot of my RPGs.
Right. And what do you feel like is the difference between those two styles? Like, obviously, within the, I think anyone when you say JRPG automatically goes to lean like the old school Final Fantasy turn-based RPG. And when I think of Western, it's more of a kind of like action-based. What about yourself? What's your kind of like thought process on those?
Yeah, I think a lot of holistically, not looking at any specific game, a lot of JRPGs have more of a linear progression style
Mm.
in that the game is pushing you through, I guess, similar to like the way a Pokemon game does, in that you start at Route 1 or Route 201, whatever they call it, and you make your way over to Route 30, and you just go through 1, 2, 3, 4, so on, and continue the story. And a lot of JRPGs that follow a very similar mindset. Um, in their progression systems, that you're doing those leveling up and character build kind of things, but you're really progressing towards the end state, which is the same for everyone. And I think as well, like a lot of the, I guess that freedom aspect isn't necessarily there in the same way as a lot of the Western styles that have really focused on a lot more open world, or just thinking of the Bethesda titles and even the Bioware games that had a lot of that linear style of progression. Mass Effect was one that I forgot to mention before, but thinking of that linear progression is still there in Bioware titles in a way, but you have a bit more control over how you want to take on the quests. And Mass Effect 2 was what it was in the end, that there was so many different end states. And yeah, I think that's probably the main thing, is that for me, that I would notice is that a lot of the quests and progression are pulling you through a pretty linear path. There's not a whole lot of divergence that you can do.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that makes sense. And I mean, what is I'm gonna say, obviously, we started on Pokemon and all those kind of things. I feel like from obviously knowing your content and watching what you've done, you've kind of lent towards, like, let's say, the Western style. And I think I know you've got a lot of love for, again, BioWare's titles and Bethesda's titles specifically. What is it about their title specifically that kind of like captured your love and imagination?
It's funnily that it's different for both. So for Bioware, it's a lot of the characters and the writing. You think of characters like Garrus in Mass Effect. There isn't really anyone necessarily super memorable in a lot of the Dragon Ages, other than starts with M in the first one, Morrigan.
Yeah.
Yeah, whatever her name is, starts with M. The witch.
No, yeah, Morrigan. Yeah,
That lady.
that lady.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's a lot of the writing in Bioware is what drew me in from their side. They have a lot of those elements that I really liked about Bethesda games, minus most of the open world sides, but the freedom in how you want to tackle quests and do kind of whatever you choose to in those worlds. And um, Mass Effect was just such a pinnacle of writing for me. Like, I think that there's so much good quality writing in there and choices that you can make, and especially when you get to Mass Effect 3 and the Citadel DLC and everything, and there's just the character arcs in there are just really make that game stand out. And from like the Bethesda side, it's a lot of that. They have some of that as well. Like, there is definitely quality writing in Bethesda titles. But what really drew me in is just the immersion of the world, being able to press W and just go wherever you want.
Mm.
Like, you don't have to follow any specific thing. You can almost live in the world and just wander around, do whatever. Sometimes you don't feel like doing a quest, sometimes you don't feel like saving the world or doing whatever. You just want to, oh, that looks cool. You just want to press W and go that way. And that's something that I still to this day, like, I'll boot up Red Dead Redemption 2 and just wander around. Like, I find it very cathartic to relax to an immersive game and just do nothing in that world.
I think I've had a conversation with you previously talking about things like Fallout, where I think Fallout 4, I put about 60 hours in without reaching Diamond City, for those that know it. I spent so much time doing side quests and things like that. It was just a ton of fun. And again, like you say, it's that open world immersion of just being able to just disappear into a world and just go do what you want. And yeah, I think that kind of speaks to me as well. And I mean, obviously, we talked about that. Like, what is your kind of like ideal RPG? Because I know we covered like the immersion, the open worldness, like the Bioware, the Bethesdas. What is your ideal RPG like experience?
Hmm, that's a tough question to answer.
Gonna have to do it. I'm
Because
sorry.
there's something there's something good about it. Like, you could always find those different things, but
Hmm.
um, I like a barren world that is filled with things to do. So not something like Cyberpunk had a fantastic world, but it's based in a city. It's very dense. There's stuff everywhere,
Yeah.
regardless of issues with the game. But something like a Bethesda world, a Fallout, a Skyrim, or whatever. There are it's a huge open plan. Even The Witcher is very similar in this regard, that it's very open and there is stuff happening around you that you interact with things. You always find stuff. I like that big open plan. I like the that coming out moment, like when Bethesda do it in all of their games, where you come out of the vault or you come out of prison in all of the Elder Scrolls games, and you just see like the world, like
Hmm.
that moment. A good RPG has to have that coming out moment, and
Yeah.
and Zelda Breath of the Wild has it as well. When you come out of hibernation and you stand over the world, and you're like, it just blows your mind. You
The
got like
title screen, yeah, when that finally pops
exactly
up,
that.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. That moment, nailing that moment is so important. I
Hmm.
think, to like giving, like, hooking me personally into your RPG. If you nail that moment, I'm in. And from there, it's just stuff to do. Give me quality quests that are all chained together, that actually have an arc. It's not, just go and save this thing and then come back and go and save something else or whatever. Like, I want characters to progress. I want interesting characters that I can interact with and learn about their history. The Outer Worlds with Pavati, who's just an incredible character in that game. She's fantastically written and so unique, and that she was the highlight of that game. But characters like that are just so deep and have like it's a common trope in RPGs that every male or female you come across is just so attracted to you. You're just like the god in that universe. Like
Yeah.
you're the Paul Rudd of that
Ah,
universe, right? Like everyone wants to be you, but having characters that don't
yeah.
like you or like don't feel that way about you but are still just really interesting to talk to, and creating like that friendship in the world is just really engaging. And having good RPG systems give me a stats screen that I can look at, tell me what those stats do, make sure that they actually do something in the world. Don't just let me press, increase this stat by 1 and it does nothing. I want to feel what that's actually doing
Mhm.
compared to if I chose a different option. And yeah, whatever the weapon system is, good combat, quality, weapons to control and movement and stuff. And yeah, I think you could probably find a cross between The Witcher 3, I don't know, a Fallout or an Elder Scrolls game, and then some of the amazing writing you get from like a Mass Effect 2 or an Outer Worlds or something. Put that somewhere into a mix and smash them all together, and out will come my favorite RPG.
That sounds like a big title, and I can't wait to play
Oh yes.
it.
Well, Xbox own most of those studios,
They
so hire me,
do, they
Xbox. I'll
do.
make you an RPG.
Yeah, I'm gonna say, like, going into that, like, obviously Xbox have basically gone out of their way to buy every big Western RPG developer right now. Are
Yeah.
you excited for the future in regards to Xbox specifically, or just in general?
I
Like,
am extremely excited for Xbox.
mhm,
Like they have literally cornered the market on Western RPGs. They own like one of the best Western CRPG creator in exile who made Wasteland 3 and
mhm,
Wasteland 2. And I think they're working on a third person RPG at the moment, which is still going to be interesting,
yeah,
but I wish they would stick to that CRPG style, my opinion. Then you've got Obsidian working on Avowed. It's practically looks like Skyrim, but in the Pillars of Eternity universe. Who knows what that game's going to turn out to be, but it's going to be fantastic. And obviously, they bought Bethesda, who
yeah,
make all kinds of great things, and they've got Playground making Fable. Like they are. If you love Western RPGs, you've got to have Game Pass. Really, the next
yeah,
2-3 years, it's going to be a wild time. I'm very excited to see
yeah.
what they do.
I was gonna say you need to own an Xbox, but nowadays you don't really need to do that, do you? So,
No,
but no, just yeah, just being in the Xbox ecosystem is exciting for an RPG fan.
that's right.
Um,
That's exactly right.
So I want to talk about, like, obviously the effect that RPGs have had on, like, the world of video games, because I feel like recently, and I don't know if you feel the same, but like over the last like decade or so, like RPG mechanics and just RPGs in general have kind of like infiltrated other like genres. Do you feel that's correct to say?
Yes.
Yeah.
This is a pain point of mine that I actually wrote about in uni. I wrote an essay
Okay.
about this earlier this year, which is probably going to be turned into a YouTube video in the near future. So there's a little tease for you. But essentially, the concept of an RPG has found itself littered into many other games. And the reason that they're doing this is because of the popularity that has come from JRPGs and Western RPGs in the last 10 years. That these big open world experiences and the RPG systems, and just having that RPG tag, those 3 letters on your game, will sell more copies. And I think in a lot of cases, people are trying to test that out. Ubisoft, especially,
Hmm.
pioneering just putting RPG on everything. In that article that I wrote, which will eventually come out into a video, I did some research on companies that have had marketing cycles about this new game is bringing in RPG elements. This, X and Y is trying this RPG route, and Ubisoft have done that with practically everything in the last 6-ish years since Assassin's Creed Origins. Every one of their games has had a marketing cycle that specifically talks about adding RPG elements to their game, and probably 2 of their last 6 years worth of games, I would say, are actually RPGs, being Valhalla and Assassin's Creed Odyssey.
Hmm.
Origins had some elements, but it was really more of an action adventure, and a lot of the Far Cry games. There's that same marketing cycle about adding RPG elements, and that's absolutely not an RPG. Same with Division, borderline in a way, but I still think that's more of an action RPG. It's just got a gear system, and a gear system doesn't mean that you're an RPG, in my opinion. I think that it's sugarcoating what an actual RPG is, and the main thesis of the piece that I wrote was that we in the gaming industry need a classification board that not only classifies what, G, PG, whatever rating it is, but what the actual product is. You think about movies, for example. You go see a horror movie, it's a horror movie,
Yeah.
but in that horror movie, if the victim or whatever, Jack the Ripper is chasing them, and they're like, oh my god, and they run into a room and the TV turns on and they watch SpongeBob on the TV for 10 minutes, that doesn't make it a kids movie.
No.
It's still a horror movie.
Yeah.
Right? But you can't, in games, if that exact same thing happened, we would say this is a horror and a 2D platformer because SpongeBob is doing this. But it's like we combine all of these genres together, and you end up with a game that's a action, horror, adventure with RPG elements that also maybe is a platformer because you do this one platforming section, and we just get this confuddled mess. Like, and I think that it's I see why they do it, because it's marketing, and you want to try and. I personally, right, I love RPGs. So if you tell me that your new game, even if it's not, has RPG elements, I'm instantly going to be interested. And it's the same with anyone. If your favorite genre is horror, and the next Assassin's Creed game, they're like, we're adding horror elements, you're instantly going to be like, bang, oh, tell me more. Like, what is this? That's that marketing cycle hype. And I think that we really need to be more stricter around what an actual genre is, and how we apply that to games.
I'm going to say, to get off the subject a little bit from RPGs stuff, do you think that comes from maybe video games being a bit more nuanced than other media, though?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think so you can kind of like not shoehorn, but you can kind of like bring in those elements and they still work. Like you mentioned, obviously Assassin's Creed Odyssey, one of my favorite games of all time, and I think that led really well to kind of light RPG elements and like building up your weapons and your class and stuff, and obviously had a skill tree. So these kind of like staples of RPG games, and I think they brought them in. But on the surface, it's not really an RPG game. It is very much just an action adventure, an open world that you're around in. But do you think this is just a sign of how popular RPGs are becoming or have become? Because I feel like in my youth, I'm probably older than a lot of people, but in my youth, I felt like RPGs were these kind of things that were looked down on in the video game industry a little bit. So again, like especially in the West, anyway. Personally, I felt like it was very much in the case of like shooters, racers. Those were the big titles, and RPGs were these things on the side a little bit. Would you agree?
Yeah, definitely. Like, the concept of an RPG is much more technically demanding than a lot of other genres, because of the complex systems underneath the hood before you even talk about whether your game's going to be open world or whatever it's going to be. There's so much complexity to the systems and the stats and how they interact with the game itself, as well as just like tracking all of that information and quests and dialogue choices and stuff. There's a lot of complexity under the hood before you even talk about making this beautiful open world that you can just press W and go anywhere. That's complex in itself. Whereas, in a racing game, you just follow the track. Like, it's, it's much easier to do. You're always on rails, and those on rails experiences, even shooters to a degree, like they're not necessarily on rails in a multiplayer game, but your map is set. You can't go outside those boundaries, and you just run around and shoot each other. Very much more simple. There's no hidden stats that, I pulled the trigger and maybe I miss because, my accuracy is bad with this specific gun, whatever. Like, there's much more hidden things there, and a lot of RPGs took time to catch up to that level. And I think that the technology, especially with the Xbox One and PlayStation 4, really propelled RPGs into being much more of a mainstream stay. The back in the olden times, the CRPGs, the computer RPG with the top-down view and the turn-based combat is really where a lot of the core DNA started from. Dungeons and Dragons being then ported into a computer game with Baldur's Gate, and how that really kind of took off. And then now that the technology is caught up and we can have these open world and really complex experiences rather than having that top down view, you can actually pull yourself down in front of the character. And I think that is much more of an easy way for people to get into a genre. Like, if you don't like, I'm losing my voice today, I'm so sorry.
It's okay.
I've been talking so much all week, and now it's Saturday. Yeah, if you don't like CRPGs, that top-down view, you're used to shooters, you're used to racing games, you're used to looking at your character from behind. Now that technology is caught up, that we can have those open world or big expansive experiences from a first person or a third person perspective, it's much easier for the mainstream audience to get into that experience and actually that barrier of entry is much lower. A lot of people see that top down view with your turn based systems, and it's too complex. They just have no interest in it. But it's much more engaging to look at a character, a high definition, cool looking character from a first person, third person perspective, and connect with that character. And then because you've connected with something in the game, you'll continue to follow it through. And I think that's partly why a lot of them, it's those RPGs and that RPG elements have leaked into the mainstream, I think.
I think it is because of, like you say, you mentioned there briefly, like obviously coming from the Dungeons and Dragons era of like tabletop RPGs, top down, you got a board. But this is kind of becoming, like you say, more immersive as an experience. So you actually feel like you're in the character rather than just looking at them. And
Yep.
yeah, it's probably that kind of like it's easier to grasp hold of. And you say like the technology, obviously, you can back up the visuals with that rich, complex like systems that are all in prevalent from RPGs.
Absolutely. And I think the way that a lot of visuals is so important these days, and it's also why games take so long and cost
Mhm.
so much money, is because everything's so high definition these days. But that's part of the reason why games have really taken off in the last 10 years, in my opinion, is because it's so much easier to grasp something that looks realistic than something that just looks like a bunch of pixels on a screen. It's much easier to create that connection with characters that look human, look realistic, or don't have to be human, they could be whatever, but that look realistic, that you can actually find an identifying factor that will draw you into that experience. And I think that's part of why games has really exploded in the last 15-ish years, rather
Mhm.
than what we used to have on the screen of just a bunch of pixels running around that kind of looked like people or things, but you didn't really. You had to kind of get that suspension of disbelief. But it's much easier when things are much more clean and crisp and immersive.
I definitely had a hard time explaining to people that Final Fantasy VII was one of my favorite games when you saw like 8 polygons running around with a giant sword. But yeah,
Hmm.
no, it's a lot easier nowadays to explain it. And I mean, obviously,
Exactly.
we talk about like obviously that modern day coming, catching up and stuff, and the graphics and stuff. Like talking about the future of RPGs, like how do you like see it at the moment? Because obviously, like big explosion, pretty much every game wants to put RPG elements in there. What do you see being like the big new thing, or like what is the big thing you want from RPGs going forward in the future?
The big thing that I want and that I expect personally the direction to go is in AI, in a development further in AI and the complex systems underneath the hood, using the extra horsepower they get from the next generation and next generation PCs to do more complex computing based around the characters, the NPCs around you, and how they interact with you in the world space. So a lot of most people probably think that the next generation of RPGs is just going to be much more land. We're just going to get, from 5 kilometers, it's going to be 10 kilometers and it's just going to look prettier. But realistically, we could do that today. But the reason we don't do that today is because no one wants to spend a million hours exploring this giant barren wasteland of stuff. You've got to contain their experience to whatever your world space is going to be. I don't think games will necessarily grow wider, they will just grow denser. And whether that be the systems inside it, you think about a Fallout game, Fallout 4, for example, when you go into Boston, all the buildings, you can only go in maybe 1 in 5 of them, right? Maybe all of them will be open, but the actual AI inside the characters will be more complex. You always have in today's RPGs, someone is either an ally or they are an enemy when you're walking around the world.
Yeah.
You can absolutely identify what something is immediately. You just know it's either got a green name tag or a red name tag.
Mm.
And part of that reason is because of how complex AI is to make, is that you can't have something that will dynamically interact with the character or the world space around you, because that just takes up too much computing power. And so if you think about, what happens if you've got all these gangs, and similar to Cyberpunk, using that as an example, you've got all these gangs and how they, for the most part, they're allies, but they talk like they're not allies, but you can't, they're just like blasé people in the world. You can shoot them, they'll shoot back, etc., etc. But what happens if you make a decision and it dynamically updates all of the AI code to interact with you differently for that specific subset of NPCs? Or you have a certain follower with you, and just because that follower is with you, they will engage with you in a different way. And that's not just them saying, which games do nowadays, was just you talk to them and they say, "Oh, I don't like that guy."
Hmm.
It's like that's just a voice line, and just add that piece of code in, right? I mean, actually change fundamentally the way the AI will interact, and then having the AI interact with themselves in a human way. like not scripted events that are just, two characters. You walk into Whiterun for the first time, you've never been there before in Skyrim, and you walk up and there's two characters and they speak to each other for literally the only time in the entire game. It's just that it's coded that the first time you go there, they will communicate with each other, tell you some information, and then they'll turn the other way, right? What happens if characters can interact freely in a human element? That's what I really think will bring RPGs and that immersion aspect further. Games will always continue to look better. I don't know if things will always look 10 years from now, something will look better than a Red Dead Redemption 2, than whatever Starfield's going to look like, whatever these RPGs are going to look like. But that complex AI stuff and actually feeling natural is what I think will really propel RPGs forward. And that extra computing power of AI is what I think will really push it further.
I'd agree with that. Like, I think a game that I know we've both played recently, Baldur's Gate, seems to be doing something quite clever with that. In so much as like the conversations you have with their characters are a lot, although still scripted in the most instances, they are very nuanced in the conversations that you have, and certain obviously interactions will affect certain characters in different ways. And yet, it does feel very immersive in that way, without it being like you say. Like all about the graphics and things like that, and that does feel more immersive in so much of an RPG element, and that I do love. And I'd agree that like the background, like character dynamics, is probably the best progression going forwards, I think.
Absolutely. You look at something like Watch Dogs Legion
Hmm.
and what they were trying to do with their AI and their characters, and how you could kind of be anyone, do anything. That, not necessarily that system specifically, but those kind of interesting things of AI and making content in that way and characters interact in that way is, I think, something that will become more of a mainstay as we look 5-10 years into the future. I expect that you'll be having a conversation with an AI driven NPC that is actually making choices based on what you're saying through an AI. It's not someone has actually scripted or coded that specific phrase. It's based on what you've done in the world, and they're communicating with you by making that choice themselves with the game code, is what I expect.
Cool. No, I like that. I'm excited to see that happen in the future. Again, just going into the future, obviously, we've talked about a couple of games. We've mentioned things like Cyberpunk and how like their world isn't as expansive, but it's very dense. Again, do you see that being like the future now of like packing in like these really big, like say like dense worlds of like cityscapes or like castles and things like that, and like fully fledged lived in worlds rather than these things like the earlier Fallouts, where it's very open world but expansive but very barren. Do you see that being like the future, short term at least?
I think we'll see more of that litter into it, but I think that there is still something inherently enjoyable about having a legitimate open world that allows you to go anywhere, and that's actually very open and expansive. You look at something like The Witcher 3 and what they did with Novigrad, and that's a city landscape, also by CD Projekt Red, that it's very dense in its scape. A lot of the NPCs just literally walk from A to B; they don't do anything. But
Hmm.
having that, they've got that kind of best of both worlds, and having the open world around you plus a really dense city environment, and something that's not being a game developer, but just from what I understand would be extremely hard to do, is a high quality dense environment like a Cyberpunk is in that city, and like Novigrad is. Even from the dev diaries I've watched about The Witcher 3, Novigrad was one of the hardest things they had to do in the game because of how dense and that area is, and how there's so much stuff happening in the city. And that's something that in the next generation we'll absolutely see more of, is a dense space like that, a city space, because a lot of people in today's world live in cities. They live in dense environments, and it's something that you just couldn't replicate well in games that actually felt real because of just how much, putting all of that assets and NPCs and having things interactable and do stuff. It's very hard to do, and that's why in a lot of Bethesda titles, even in the big cities like Whiterun and Winterhold, and even in Fallout, in Diamond City, it's very small. It's
Hmm.
very in contained. You have to go through specific loading screens just to get into that city environment, and it's much harder to do those really big open areas when there's so much happening in that small area.
Yeah, I think maybe the technology is going to help with that. So again,
Yeah.
talking about the Xbox and the obviously the PlayStation as well, the SSDs and reading directly from RAM and things like that without going for the the storage. I think those will help in that kind of like development. And I don't know about yourself, but I'm excited for like 2, 3 years down the line to see what people do with that technology, specifically in the RPG world as well. Uh,
Absolutely.
yeah. So I mean, obviously, we've talked about a few titles here. What is the next big title that you're looking forward to? Whether it be like an update to an existing title, or a brand new title that's coming, or a sequel. What are the big titles that you're looking forward to in the short term future?
The immediate short term, Elden Ring is something I'm very intrigued with. I don't think that's necessarily going to push, RPGs much further than we already are. But I'm very intrigued. I'm just excited to play that game. I love Souls games. It's open world. Love open world. There's a lot of things in there that are for me. But the next probably big RPG that I'm very interested in is Starfield, because we still don't really know what that game is. And regardless of what you think of Fallout 76 or any of Bethesda's work in the past, they have not made a brand new IP from scratch since the 1990s, with Arena being the first Elder Scrolls. They didn't make Fallout, they bought that
Hmm.
license, and Fallout 3 was fantastic, being their first really delve into it. And it's going to be extremely interesting to see what Todd Howard and the team there, that have been a lot of Bethesda Game Studios staff, have been there for years. They are, you work at that company and you work there for 20, 15 years, however long it is. And I'm very intrigued to see what you do with people that have been just working on two different franchises, primarily one being the baby of Elder Scrolls for 15 years. What happens when you take those away and you make something that is completely brand new from scratch? And what does that look like, especially in a sci-fi setting? What does that open world, what do those quests look like? It's something inherently uh motivating and enjoyable about trying something completely new, especially if you've been working the same job for X amount of years. I expect that team has put so much time and effort into that game that I'm really interested to see what that turns out to be.
Yeah. For me as well, I'd agree with that. I think as well, I keep going on about them, but the backing of Xbox recently,
Hmm.
with the
Absolutely.
kind of freedom they're giving their studios, I am excited to see what kind of support they're giving Bethesda to make the game that they want to make. And like you say, being the first like new title that they've made in coming up on like 20, 30 years, is extremely exciting to see what they're going to come out with. But yeah, no, I'm excited for that. I think personally for me as well, I'm excited to see what the next Cyberpunk and Witcher updates look like. So I know we're getting the next gen updates for those next year. And me personally, I loved Cyberpunk. I didn't have any
Hmm.
issues like a lot of people did, and I totally understand that those issues are valid, and I understand why people might have problems with the game. But I am very excited to see what they do given the time now, and with new expansions and things like that. Is I gotta say Cyberpunk a game you're gonna probably go back to after playing it?
Yeah, I actually played it last night
Oh, really? Okay,
for the
so
first time in months. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, how was it?
I'm It's improved.
Yeah,
It's definitely improved. I didn't have any problems with it initially. I it was pretty much same kind of mindset to you. I thought the game was good, not great. It was definitely unfinished in a lot of regards, but the core underlying game that was there was something special about it, and I just wish they had that extra time to finish the game. Like, because you could tell just from playing it that underneath the hood and the characters, how deep they were and interesting, and just that the whole first person perspective and those cutscenes really playing out around you, that you can kind of look around and just do whatever. Like, you don't have to necessarily interact with the cutscene. Like, that is amazing. Like, that's something that no one's even tried before. Still haven't. We still don't have a game that allows you to just sit in a cutscene and you can look at someone to the left and say something to them, or look at someone to the right and say something to them.
yeah,
No one's done that. And that's seeing that system finished, if they had the time, would have been fantastic. But um, yeah, Cyberpunk is great, and I still am enjoying it, just getting back into it. The music, like, the game looks beautiful. There is a lot to enjoy in Cyberpunk. I just hope that you know we'll see what happens with these expansions and future content, that um they can continue to fix the game. It was a little disheartening when I went to boot it up and it says 3 months ago was the last patch, but we know there's more coming. It's yeah, we'll just see how we go, I guess.
Yeah, I think the big focus is obviously the next gen and just the
Yeah.
stability for that. Well, I mean, I guess that's pretty much most of the questions I've got for you. The only thing I would say is obviously I know there's probably like not a lot of people out there that haven't played any, but for anyone who's not really delved into like a proper RPG, what would be your kind of advice for getting into one, and where would you say start? And what are the kind of like things to look out for in these kind of games?
It's hard to say where to start because without knowing, they're so different. RPGs are such a broad genre. You've got your post-apocalyptics, your medievals, you've got sci-fi stuff. There's so much. Even the JRPGs they're complex in their own way. There's so many different kinds of RPGs. There's CRPGs, the top-down, the old classic things. Like, there's a lot to choose from, and I think that someone who hasn't really delved into it, the best thing that I would suggest to do is to find a genre that you enjoy from other mediums. So if you watch a lot of sci-fi shows, maybe cyberpunk might be something to try. If you watch a lot of medieval shows, something like Elder Scrolls, or what have you would be something to try. A genre that you can connect with to start with, and then most RPGs in their initial stages aren't so complex because everyone understands, as a game developer and as someone playing a game, that you've got to actually introduce your player to that world. And it can be very daunting to boot up an RPG that is often going to ask you to enter stats and create your character and what's your name and what do you look like and what stats are you going to pick. I don't know what strength, endurance, and charisma mean. I don't know. Like, it can be complicated. And I think that just starting out, just press X through all of that stuff. Who cares? You'll level up and change it anyway. The main thing is getting you into that world and then doing the tutorial and understanding the game mechanics and talking to people, and you'll eventually find the enjoyment. I think Bethesda games of the Skyrim, which so many people have played these days, the Fallouts, everything, they do a very good job of slowly introducing you to their world and their systems, and especially that open that moment where you come out into the world, after you've kind of got through the tutorial, and you can kind of do anything. They do such a good job of slowly introducing you to the game systems. Some RPGs skip a lot of that stuff, especially the CRPGs, because they kind of expect you've got a bit of that base knowledge. And CRPGs can be very difficult to start with, like a Baldur's Gate or a Pathfinder, especially Pathfinder. They're extremely complex. But finding that game genre that you connect with, and then just starting and kind of just ignoring the stats and then the kind of gobbledygook that they throw at you, and just putting yourself in that world, and eventually you'll connect with it and it'll eventually start to make sense. Like all the stuff under the hood, I think, is once you're in it, you'll figure it out.
Oh, that makes total sense. And then the final question I've got, which actually someone posted on Twitter: why do you hate Final Fantasy VII Remake?
I saw this and I considered responding, but I don't hate Final Fantasy VII Remake. I just don't like it. It's not for me.
That's fair.
That It's absolutely an RPG, and it's a JRPG, which isn't my favorite, but I think that game has so many design flaws that people relish as it still being such a great game. Like, it got so many 10s out of 10s, but in a vacuum, without the nostalgia of where that game came from, it has so many issues that a quality RPG in 2020 or 2019, whenever I think it was last year it came out.
Yeah.
Who knows with time these days? That a quality RPG has really advanced on, and the developers of, obviously they're remaking a game that is however many years old, and they're adding their own things to it. And it feels like to me that game was made in a dark room with no internet connection, and they had no idea what people have done in the last 20 years for RPGs as a whole.
I mean, I
Because
get that. Yeah.
like the combat is enjoyable, but there are way too many combat encounters that mean nothing. You turn a corner and you run into the same enemy that you've already fought for the last 2 hours, and you just have to just mash the attack buttons, and then you just keep on moving forward. And there's so much of that. Whereas I personally, I like to explore a world in my own time. I don't want to have to fight every 5 seconds because the game developers are scared that I'm going to lose enjoyment. I also don't want to collect cats for half an hour because I didn't realize that one was on a roof, because that's not a side quest. But there is something good about that Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy as a whole. It's just that I think that game is people give it too much props. If you take the nostalgia glasses off, I think that it has some fundamental issues.
That's fair. I
Personally,
mean, I'm going to defend it a little bit in so much as, like, say, I've said Final Fantasy VII was my first real introduction to like massive RPGs. I have definitely got those nostalgia glasses, but I think it's definitely a remake rather than a new game. In so much as it is very much into the tropes of JRPGs, in so much as, like you say, you turn a corner, there's a bad guy there. That is pretty much JRPGs to a T,
hmm
except they just randomly start attacking you. So yeah, no, I can understand why, if like you said, you've made it clear that you're not a massive JRPG fan. It wasn't something you grew up on. So again, I guess it's something, if you have that nostalgia for that kind of section of the genre, I think, yeah, there's probably more to get out of it, and you're more comfortable with that kind of combat systems and stuff like that. And yeah, there is a lot of fetch quests in old JRPGs as well, so I can feel, yeah, not searching for cats all the time is probably not going to work for you. But no, I
Okay.
think on that note, now we've defended Final Fantasy VII, I just want to say thank you for joining me. It's been absolutely a pleasure to talk RPGs with you. If people want to find you, where can they find you?
Before we do that, I do
Okay.
like Persona though.
Okay, that's
I
fine.
do like Persona's my jam.
Okay.
Love the characters in Persona. Anyway, you can find me on YouTube at NorZZa, NORZZA. I'm on all social media as NorZZa TV because everybody has my tag on social media, sadly. But yeah, NorZZa on YouTube is the primary place to find me for all live content and RPGs. That any new RPG, especially Western RPGs that come out, I'll absolutely have a video on it.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for watching. All the links will be down below, so make sure to check them out. But until next time, goodbye.